Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Philosophy, where the greatest minds in human history become gentle companions for your journey into rest. Tonight, we're embarking on a quiet exploration through the brilliant world of Moses Maimonides, a towering figure whose thoughts shaped both medieval philosophy and religious understanding for centuries to come. This is a story of reason meeting faith, of ancient wisdom finding new expression, and of one man's patient attempt to bridge worlds that others thought could never touch. Before we begin this gentle journey through Maimonides' extraordinary mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a late evening in Edinburgh or the small hours in Manila, you're very welcome here in this sleepy corner of philosophy. If you find these nocturnal wanderings through great ideas helpful for settling your thoughts, consider giving the video a like and perhaps subscribing to join our community of thoughtful dreamers. Now, I do hope this exploration won't prove so fascinating that it keeps you wide awake, though if it does, at least you'll drift off with some of history's most profound insights gently settling in your mind. So pull up your blankets, let your breathing slow, and allow us to step quietly into the world of one of philosophy's most remarkable figures. Moses Maimonides lived in the 12th century, a time when the world seemed both vast and intimate, when scholars could spend decades pondering a single question, and when the pursuit of truth was considered the highest calling of human life. Born in Cordoba in 1135, he would become known as the Great Eagle, a mind so sharp and comprehensive that his influence would ripple through both Jewish and Islamic thought, touching Christian philosophy and reaching into our modern understanding of reason itself. But let's begin not with grand titles or historical impact, but with something quieter and more personal. Imagine a young boy in medieval Spain, surrounded by scrolls and books, watching his father study by candlelight. This was Moses ben Maimon, later known simply as Maimonides, growing up in a household where learning was not just encouraged but sacred, where questions were welcomed rather than feared, and where the life of the mind was seen as a form of worship itself. His childhood was marked by upheaval. The Almohad conquest forced his family into exile when he was just 13, beginning a journey that would take them through Spain and Morocco before finally settling in Egypt. Yet this displacement, painful as it must have been, gave Maimonides something precious: exposure to different cultures, languages, and ways of thinking. He learned Arabic alongside Hebrew, studied Islamic philosophy alongside Jewish texts, and began to see that wisdom could wear many different clothes while remaining essentially the same. This early experience of living between worlds would define his entire approach to knowledge. Where others saw contradiction, Maimonides saw conversation. Where others insisted on choosing sides, he sought synthesis. His great project would be to show that reason and faith, philosophy and religion, the wisdom of Aristotle and the teachings of Moses, could not only coexist, but could illuminate each other in the most beautiful ways. Maimonides believed that the human mind was humanity's greatest gift, a spark of the divine that allowed us to understand both the world around us and our place within it. But he also understood that this gift came with responsibility. Knowledge wasn't something to be hoarded or used for personal gain. It was a trust, something to be cultivated carefully and shared generously with those ready to receive it. His approach to learning was methodical, patient, almost meditative in its thoroughness. He would examine a question from every possible angle, consider objections before they were raised, and always seek the most elegant solution. There was something deeply peaceful about his intellectual style, a quality that makes his works perfect companions for quiet reflection. The cornerstone of Maimonides' thinking was his belief in the absolute unity and perfection of God. But this wasn't merely a theological position for him. It was the foundation for understanding everything else. If God was truly one and perfect, then the universe created by such a being must be rational, orderly, and comprehensible to human reason. This meant that studying philosophy, mathematics, and natural science wasn't separate from religious devotion. It was religious devotion of the highest order. This insight allowed Maimonides to embrace the philosophical works of Aristotle without feeling that he was betraying his faith. Aristotle's careful observations of the natural world, his logical methods, and his systematic approach to knowledge were all, in Maimonides' view, ways of coming closer to understanding the divine mind that had created everything with such precise order. But Maimonides wasn't simply adopting Greek philosophy wholesale. He was transforming it, showing how it could serve purposes its original authors never imagined. Where Aristotle spoke of an unmoved mover as a philosophical necessity, Maimonides saw the living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Where Greek thinkers often saw the material world as somehow inferior to the realm of pure ideas, Maimonides found the physical universe to be a magnificent expression of divine wisdom, worthy of careful study and deep appreciation. One of his most profound contributions was his understanding of how we can speak about God at all. If God is truly infinite and perfect, beyond all human categories and limitations, then how can our finite minds and limited language say anything meaningful about the divine? This wasn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle for Maimonides. It was a practical question that affected how people prayed, how they understood their relationship with God, and how they made sense of religious texts. His solution was elegant and revolutionary. When we say that God is good or wise or powerful, we're not describing God in the same way we might describe a human being who possesses these qualities. Instead, we're pointing towards something beyond our ordinary concepts, using human language as a kind of ladder that we climb toward understanding, knowing all the while that the reality we're approaching transcends anything our words can capture. This insight had profound implications. It meant that religious language was both meaningful and mysterious, both essential and ultimately inadequate. It required a kind of intellectual humility, an acknowledgement that our greatest achievements in understanding were still only glimpses of a reality far greater than ourselves. Maimonides developed this into a systematic approach to divine attributes that would influence centuries of theological thought. Rather than saying what God is, we can only say what God is not. God is not limited, not changing, not composite, not physical. Through this via negativa, this path of negation, we can approach a more accurate understanding of the divine nature without falling into the trap of reducing God to human categories. This might sound abstract, but Maimonides saw it as deeply practical. If we truly understood the transcendence of God, we would approach life with appropriate humility. We would be less likely to confuse our own limited perspectives with ultimate truth. We would be more open to learning, more tolerant of different approaches to the same fundamental questions, more aware of how much we still don't know. At the same time, Maimonides believed passionately in the importance of positive knowledge. His negative theology wasn't meant to lead to skepticism or despair about the possibility of understanding. Rather, it was meant to clear away false conceptions so that genuine knowledge could flourish. By understanding the limits of human reason, we could better appreciate its genuine achievements. This balance between intellectual humility and confident inquiry runs through all of Maimonides' work. He was simultaneously one of history's most systematic thinkers and one of its most aware of the limitations of systematic thinking. He built grand philosophical structures while remaining conscious that they were, at best, partial reflections of a reality that exceeded any human construction. His medical practice reinforced this balanced approach to knowledge. As a physician in the court of Saladin, Maimonides had to deal with concrete problems that required practical solutions. He couldn't retreat into pure abstraction. His philosophical insights had to prove themselves in the real world of human suffering and healing. This practical dimension of his thought appears throughout his philosophical writings. He wasn't interested in ideas for their own sake, but in ideas that could help people live better lives. His philosophy was always connected to ethics. to questions of how we should treat one another and how we should understand our obligations to both God and humanity. The integration of practical and theoretical wisdom would become one of Maimonides' most distinctive contributions to philosophy. He showed that the highest forms of intellectual achievement weren't separate from the challenges of daily life, but were precisely what equipped us to meet those challenges with wisdom and grace. As we settle deeper into this exploration of his thought, we can already sense the gentle rhythm of a mind that sought not to conquer truth, but to serve it, not to impose human categories on reality, but to let reality teach us what our categories should be. There's something inherently peaceful about this approach, something that invites rest rather than restlessness, contemplation rather than anxiety. The young exile who had wandered from Spain to Morocco to Egypt had found something more valuable than any homeland, a way of thinking that could make any place a home for the seeking mind, a method of inquiry that could find the sacred in the most ordinary questions, and a vision of human dignity grounded in our capacity to participate, however partially, in the divine wisdom that governs all things. This foundation of integrated wisdom would shape everything Maimonides wrote, but perhaps nowhere more clearly than in his approach to prophecy and divine revelation. Where others saw prophecy as something entirely mysterious, beyond human understanding, Maimonides found patterns, structures, and profound philosophical insights that could illuminate both the nature of divine communication and the heights of human spiritual development. For Maimonides, prophecy wasn't simply a matter of God choosing random individuals to receive messages. It was the natural result of a person reaching the highest levels of intellectual and moral perfection. The prophet was someone who had developed their rational faculties so fully and purified their character so completely that they became capable of receiving divine illumination in ways that ordinary minds could not. This understanding transformed how he read the Hebrew Bible. Where others saw only miraculous interventions that defied natural law, Maimonides found sophisticated philosophical teachings encoded in narrative form. The stories of Abraham, Moses, and the other prophets weren't just historical accounts, but philosophical allegories that could teach profound truths about God, the universe, and human nature to those who knew how to read them properly. Consider how gently this reframes our relationship with sacred texts. Rather than demanding blind acceptance of difficult passages, Maimonides invited careful, thoughtful interpretation. He trusted that genuine understanding would only deepen rather than diminish reverence. The more clearly we could see the wisdom embedded in prophetic writings, the more we would appreciate both the divine source of that wisdom and the remarkable human beings who had been capable of receiving and transmitting it. This hermeneutical approach required what Maimonides called the Guide for the Perplexed, his masterwork that sought to help thoughtful believers navigate the apparent tensions between philosophical reason and religious faith. The very title reveals his pastoral concern. He wasn't writing for abstract academics, but for real people who found themselves caught between different ways of understanding truth, people whose sincere seeking had led them into confusion rather than clarity. The guide unfolds like a patient conversation between teacher and student, addressing specific doubts and difficulties while gradually building toward a comprehensive vision of reality. Maimonides understood that intellectual confusion often reflected deeper spiritual struggles. People weren't just puzzled by logical contradictions, but troubled by what they saw as threats to their deepest commitments and values. His response was characteristically both rigorous and compassionate. He would never dismiss genuine philosophical difficulties or pretend that complex questions had simple answers. But neither would he allow intellectual challenges to undermine the fundamental truths that give life meaning and direction. Instead, he showed how apparent contradictions could be resolved through more careful thinking, how surface conflicts often pointed toward deeper harmonies. The structure of the guide itself reflects this therapeutic approach. Maimonides begins with the most basic questions about religious language and divine attributes, gradually building toward more complex issues of prophecy, providence, and the nature of human happiness. Each section prepares the reader for what follows, creating a kind of intellectual and spiritual journey that mirrors the development of wisdom itself. Central to this journey is Maimonides' understanding of the relationship between knowledge and virtue. He didn't see these as separate domains, but as intimately connected aspects of human flourishing. True knowledge necessarily led to better action, while genuine virtue required clear understanding. The person who truly grasped the nature of reality would naturally live in accordance with that reality. This integration appears most clearly in his analysis of the biblical commandments. Rather than seeing religious law as arbitrary divine commands that must be obeyed without understanding, Maimonides found rational purposes underlying even the most seemingly inexplicable requirements. Dietary laws promoted health and spiritual discipline. Ritual observances created regular opportunities for reflection and community building. Even sacrificial practices, when properly understood, served important educational and psychological functions. But Maimonides went deeper than simply finding practical benefits for religious practices. He argued that the entire system of biblical law was designed to promote human intellectual and moral development. The ultimate goal wasn't mere compliance, but the formation of people capable of the highest forms of knowledge and virtue. Religious observance, properly understood, was a kind of spiritual pedagogy that gradually prepared human beings for direct knowledge of God. This educational understanding of religion had profound implications for how Maimonides thought about different levels of religious understanding. He recognized that not everyone was capable of the same degree of philosophical sophistication, but he didn't conclude that some people were therefore excluded from religious truth. Instead, he developed what scholars call his theory of multiple meanings. The same religious text or practice could communicate truth at different levels simultaneously. Simple believers could find in biblical narrative straightforward moral lessons that would guide their daily lives. More sophisticated readers could discover deeper philosophical teachings about the nature of reality. The most advanced students could glimpse profound metaphysical truths that connected them directly to divine wisdom. This approach solved several problems at once. It preserved the accessibility of religious truth for ordinary believers, while acknowledging the legitimate insights of philosophical inquiry. It explained why religious texts often seemed to contain contradictory teachings, without concluding that they were therefore unreliable, and it provided a framework for ongoing intellectual development that never required abandoning earlier commitments but only deepening and refining them. The genius of this system was its combination of democratic accessibility and aristocratic excellence. Everyone could participate in religious life at their own level of understanding, but there was always room for growth, always higher levels of insight available to those willing to make the necessary intellectual and moral effort. Religious truth was like a mountain with many paths to the summit, each appropriate for different kinds of travellers, but all leading toward the same ultimate destination. Maimonides' own life exemplified this integration of different levels of wisdom. As a practicing physician, he dealt daily with the immediate physical needs of his patients. As a communal leader, he addressed practical questions of religious law and social organization. As a philosopher, he grappled with the deepest questions of existence and meaning. Yet these weren't separate activities, but different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to understanding and serving the divine order that governed all reality. His medical writings show the same systematic approach and ethical concern that characterize his philosophical works. He insisted that physicians must treat patients as whole persons, not just collections of symptoms. He emphasized the importance of diet, exercise, and emotional well-being, alongside specific medical interventions. He argued that the best medicine was preventive, helping people live in ways that maintain natural health, rather than simply responding to disease after it appeared. This holistic approach reflected his deeper conviction that the physical and spiritual dimensions of human existence were intimately connected. The body wasn't simply a temporary prison for the soul, but an integral part of human nature that deserved careful attention and respect. Proper care of physical health was itself a form of religious obligation, a way of honouring the divine image in which human beings were created. Similarly, his legal writings demonstrate the same philosophical rigour and pastoral sensitivity that mark his purely theoretical works. When addressing practical questions of religious law, Maimonides consistently sought solutions that honoured both the letter and the spirit of traditional teaching, while responding compassionately to the real needs of people in specific historical circumstances. He understood that law without wisdom could become oppressive legalism, while wisdom without law could dissolve into vague sentiment. The challenge was to maintain both the objective authority of religious teaching and its living relevance to changing human situations. This required not just technical legal knowledge, but deep insight into human nature and divine purpose. The remarkable consistency across all these different domains of Maimonides' activity reveals something important about his understanding of truth itself. For him, truth wasn't divided into separate compartments, but formed a unified whole that could be approached from many different angles. Medical truth, legal truth, philosophical truth, and religious truth were all aspects of the same fundamental reality. The person who truly understood any one dimension would naturally be led toward understanding the others as well. This vision of the unity of truth provided the foundation for what many consider Maimonides' greatest philosophical achievement, his demonstration that there could be no ultimate conflict between reason and revelation. Properly understood, philosophical inquiry and religious faith were not competitors, but collaborators in the human quest for understanding and meaning. The apparent tensions that troubled so many of his contemporaries arose, in Maimonides' view, from misunderstandings on both sides. Philosophers who rejected religious teaching often misunderstood what that teaching actually claimed. Religious believers who feared philosophical inquiry often misunderstood what philosophy could and could not accomplish. Both groups were responding to false problems that dissolved when examined with sufficient care and subtlety. As the night deepens around us and these gentle explorations of Maimonides' thought begin to settle into the quieter rhythms of approaching sleep, we can sense how his vision offers something particularly peaceful to anxious minds. Here was a thinker who found harmony where others saw only conflict, who discovered profound order underlying apparent chaos, who showed that the deepest questions could be approached with both rigorous honesty and serene confidence. His example suggests that intellectual integrity and spiritual peace are not opposing forces, but natural partners in the search for truth. The mind that seeks understanding with genuine humility and persistent effort will find not confusion but clarity, not anxiety but rest, not isolation but connection to the deepest sources of meaning and value. This harmonious integration of intellectual rigour and spiritual serenity becomes even more apparent when we turn to Maimonides' understanding of human happiness and the ultimate purpose of existence. For him, these weren't abstract philosophical questions, but intensely practical matters that affected how every person should live their daily life. His insights here offer perhaps the most gentle and reassuring aspects of his entire philosophical system. Maimonides believed that human beings were created with a natural orientation toward happiness, but that most people misunderstood what genuine happiness actually involved. They pursued temporary pleasures, material possessions, social status, or power over others, not realizing that these could never provide lasting satisfaction. Like shadows that seem substantial from a distance, but prove insubstantial when approached, these apparent goods always disappointed those who reached them. True happiness, in Maimonides' understanding, came from the development and exercise of what was most distinctively human, the capacity for knowledge and understanding. But this wasn't the dry, academic knowledge that accumulates facts without transforming the knower. It was living wisdom that shaped character, guided action, and connected the individual to the deeper structures of reality. The person who achieved this kind of understanding would find themselves in a curious state. They would be simultaneously more engaged with the world around them and more detached from its temporary fluctuations. They would care deeply about justice, truth, and the welfare of others, but they would not be anxious about outcomes beyond their control. They would work diligently to fulfill their responsibilities, but would not be crushed by failure or intoxicated by success. This ideal of enlightened engagement runs throughout Maimonides' ethical teaching. He didn't advocate withdrawal from the world, but rather a transformed way of being present within it. The wise person would participate fully in family life, professional obligations, and community responsibilities, but always from a perspective informed by understanding of what ultimately mattered and what was merely temporary. Consider how peaceful this vision becomes when applied to the inevitable difficulties of human existence. Loss, disappointment, illness, and death are not seen as meaningless evils that destroy the possibility of happiness, but as natural aspects of a reality that remains fundamentally good and intelligible. The person who truly understands the nature of existence can face these challenges with appropriate sorrow but without despair, with realistic concern but without paralyzing anxiety. Maimonides developed this insight into what became known as his Doctrine of Providence. Divine providence, in his understanding, wasn't a matter of God intervening miraculously to change the natural course of events, but rather the inherent order and purpose built into reality from the beginning. The universe was structured in such a way that genuine human flourishing was always possible for those who aligned themselves with its fundamental patterns. This meant that suffering and difficulty weren't signs of divine abandonment or cosmic meaninglessness. They were often the natural consequences of misunderstanding or misaligned priorities, opportunities for growth and learning, or simply unavoidable aspects of finite existence that didn't negate its overall goodness and purpose. The person who grasped this could face any circumstance with what Maimonides called intellectual love of God. This wasn't an emotional state that came and went with changing moods, but a stable orientation of the entire personality toward the source of all truth and goodness. It involved both deep appreciation for the magnificent order of creation and humble acceptance of one's own limited place within that order. This intellectual love represented the highest form of human spiritual achievement. The person who attained it would find that their previous anxieties about personal success or failure, social approval or disapproval, even life or death, had been transformed into a kind of serene curiosity about how the divine wisdom would unfold through whatever circumstances arose. But Maimonides was careful to emphasize that this elevated perspective didn't eliminate ordinary human emotions or responsibilities. The wise person would still grieve losses, celebrate achievements, feel concern for loved ones, and work diligently to improve conditions in the world. The difference was that these natural responses would be held within a larger framework of understanding that prevented them from becoming sources of ultimate anxiety or despair. His own life provided a compelling example of this integration. Despite facing exile, persecution, enormous professional responsibilities, and constant pressure to resolve difficult intellectual and practical problems, Maimonides maintained a remarkable equanimity and productivity throughout his long career. His letters reveal someone who took his obligations seriously, but held them lightly, who cared deeply about outcomes while remaining fundamentally peaceful about whatever results his efforts might achieve. This balance appears most clearly in his approach to teaching and writing. Maimonides knew that his philosophical insights could be transformative for those ready to receive them, but he also knew that not everyone was prepared for the same level of understanding at the same time. Rather than becoming frustrated with the limitations of his audience or compromising his commitment to truth, he developed increasingly sophisticated ways of communicating complex ideas at multiple levels simultaneously. His great legal work, the Mishneh Torah, provided clear practical guidance for religious observance, while embodying deeper philosophical principles for those capable of recognizing them. His guide for the perplexed addressed specific intellectual difficulties, while gradually leading readers toward more comprehensive understanding. Even his medical writings combined immediate practical advice with broader insights into human nature and divine purpose. This pedagogical sensitivity reflected Maimonides' understanding of how genuine teaching actually worked. Truth couldn't be simply transmitted from one mind to another, like water poured from one vessel into another. It had to be awakened, cultivated, and developed through patient engagement with questions and problems that mattered to the learner. The teacher's role was not to provide final answers, but to create conditions in which students could discover truth for themselves. This approach required enormous patience and faith in the power of human reason to find its way to understanding when properly guided. Maimonides believed that every person possessed some capacity for wisdom, though that capacity might be developed to very different degrees depending on natural ability, education, and personal effort. The teacher's responsibility was to meet each student where they were and help them move as far as they could toward greater clarity and insight. The same principle applied to Maimonides' understanding of how societies should be organized. Rather than advocating for rigid systems that imposed uniform beliefs and practices on everyone, he envisioned communities that could accommodate different levels of understanding while maintaining shared commitments to justice, truth, and mutual care. The ideal society, in his view, would be led by philosopher kings who combined the highest levels of theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom and moral excellence. But it would also provide meaningful roles for people with more ordinary abilities and interests. Everyone would contribute according to their capacities, and everyone would benefit from the overall order and purpose that wise leadership could establish and maintain. This political vision reflected Maimonides' deeper conviction that diversity and hierarchy were not problems to be eliminated, but natural features of reality that could serve beneficial purposes when properly understood and managed. Just as the human body required different organs with different functions working together harmoniously, so human society required different types of people with different roles collaborating toward shared goals. The key was ensuring that these natural differences didn't become sources of oppression or resentment. This required both wise leadership that could coordinate diverse contributions effectively, and widespread education that helped everyone understand their own dignity and importance within the larger whole. Maimonides saw his own work as contributing to this larger educational project. By demonstrating how reason and faith could be integrated, how practical and theoretical wisdom could complement each other, and how individual fulfillment could serve broader social purposes, he hoped to provide resources that could help create more just and flourishing communities. But he also understood that social reform had to begin with personal transformation. People who hadn't developed their own capacities for wisdom and virtue couldn't create institutions that would promote wisdom and virtue in others. The path toward better societies led through the cultivation of better individuals, and the cultivation of better individuals required the kind of patient, comprehensive education that Maimonides himself had received and was trying to provide for others. This insight led him to place enormous emphasis on what we might call spiritual formation. Religious practices, philosophical study, professional excellence, and ethical behaviour weren't separate activities but interconnected dimensions of a single process through which human beings gradually realised their potential for wisdom and goodness. The person who truly understood this process would approach their own development with both urgency and patience. Urgency because every moment offered opportunity for growth that might not come again, and because the stakes were so high, involving nothing less than the fulfillment of human purpose. Patience because genuine wisdom couldn't be rushed, and because setbacks and difficulties were natural parts of any authentic developmental process. This combination of urgency and patience appears throughout Maimonides' approach to intellectual work. He insisted on the importance of rigorous standards and systematic methods, refusing to accept sloppy thinking or premature conclusions. But he also recognized that understanding developed gradually through sustained engagement with questions, and that even the most gifted individuals needed time to assimilate complex insights fully. As we continue our gentle journey through the landscapes of his thought, we can sense how this developmental understanding provides a particularly restful framework for approaching the challenges of learning and growth. There's no need for anxiety about whether we're progressing quickly enough or achieving the right results. The process itself, when undertaken with sincerity and appropriate guidance, will lead naturally toward whatever understanding we're capable of achieving. Maimonides trusted in the fundamental compatibility between human nature and truth. We were created with minds capable of recognizing and appreciating reality as it actually is, not as we might wish it to be, or fear it might be. This means that honest inquiry, sustained effort, and openness to correction will gradually lead us toward greater clarity and peace, even if the specific path is sometimes difficult to predict or control. This trust in the natural orientation of reason toward truth allowed Maimonides to maintain remarkable serenity in the face of intellectual challenges that might have overwhelmed a less confident thinker. When he encountered apparent contradictions between different sources of wisdom, he didn't panic or abandon his fundamental commitments. Instead, he patiently worked to understand what each perspective was actually claiming, and how apparent conflicts might be resolved through more careful analysis. His method was always to assume that genuine truths couldn't ultimately contradict each other, even when they seemed to do so on the surface. This assumption gave him permission to take seriously both philosophical arguments and religious teachings, both empirical observations and traditional authorities, confident that patient investigation would eventually reveal their underlying harmony. The same principle guided his approach to practical problems in law, medicine, and community leadership. Rather than seeing difficult cases as threats to established principles, he treated them as opportunities to deepen understanding of how those principles applied to complex circumstances. Every challenging situation became a chance to discover new dimensions of wisdom, rather than reasons to doubt the adequacy of wisdom itself. This remarkably positive attitude toward difficulty and complexity stemmed from Maimonides' conviction that reality was fundamentally rational and good. Problems arose not because the universe was chaotic or malevolent, but because human understanding was limited and often misdirected. The appropriate response to confusion wasn't despair, but renewed commitment to the patient work of learning and growth. As the soft rhythms of this exploration begin to merge with the deeper currents of approaching sleep, we can feel how Maimonides' example offers something especially valuable to minds troubled by the apparent complexity and confusion of existence. Here was someone who faced the same fundamental questions that perplex every thoughtful person, but who found in those questions not sources of anxiety, but invitations to understanding. His legacy suggests that the human mind, when properly cultivated and oriented, can find genuine peace and clarity even in the midst of circumstances that initially seem overwhelming or threatening. The key lies not in avoiding difficult questions, but in approaching them with the right combination of intellectual honesty, moral commitment, and patient confidence in the ultimate intelligibility of existence. This confidence in the ultimate harmony of truth becomes even more apparent when we explore Maimonides' understanding of the relationship between individual contemplation and communal life. For him, the pursuit of wisdom was never a purely private affair, something that could be separated from our obligations to others or our participation in the broader human community. The person who achieved genuine understanding would naturally find themselves more, not less, connected to their fellow human beings. This insight challenges a common misconception about philosophical contemplation. We sometimes imagine the wise person as someone who withdraws from ordinary social life, becoming so absorbed in abstract questions that they lose touch with practical concerns. Maimonides saw this as a fundamental misunderstanding of what wisdom actually involved. True knowledge of reality would necessarily include understanding of our own nature as social beings, creatures who flourish only in relationship with others. The contemplative life, properly understood, wasn't an escape from community, but a deeper form of engagement with it. The person who grasped the fundamental principles that governed human existence would be better equipped, not worse equipped, to contribute to the welfare of others. They would understand more clearly what human beings actually needed for flourishing, and they would be motivated by genuine concern for the common good, rather than by narrow self-interest or confused emotions. This integration of contemplation and action appears throughout Maimonides' own career. His philosophical investigations never prevented him from maintaining an extensive medical practice, serving as a communal leader and responding to countless requests for guidance on practical matters. If anything, his theoretical understanding enhanced his practical effectiveness, providing him with principles that could guide action even in unprecedented circumstances. Consider how this understanding transforms our relationship to the apparently competing demands of personal development and social responsibility. Rather than seeing these as forces that pull us in different directions, Maimonides showed how they could reinforce each other. The person who neglected their own intellectual and moral growth would have little to offer others, while the person who ignored their obligations to community would miss essential opportunities for the kind of practical wisdom that comes only through engagement with real human needs. This balance required what Maimonides called practical wisdom, a form of understanding that could bridge the gap between general principles and particular circumstances. It wasn't enough to know abstract truths about justice, compassion, or courage. The wise person needed to develop the ability to recognize how these virtues should be expressed in specific situations, with particular people, under concrete historical conditions. Developing this practical wisdom required extensive experience with the complexities of actual human life. It couldn't be learned from books alone, though books could provide essential guidance. It demanded what Maimonides described as a kind of moral perception, the ability to see clearly what was actually happening in complicated social situations, and to respond in ways that served genuine human good rather than mere appearance or temporary advantage. This moral perception was closely connected to Maimonides' understanding of prophecy. The prophet wasn't simply someone who received supernatural communications, but someone whose intellectual and moral development had reached such a level that they could perceive clearly the deeper patterns and purposes that guided human existence. They could see through the surface confusions and conflicts of particular historical moments to the underlying principles that should govern human action. But Maimonides was careful to emphasize that this prophetic insight wasn't limited to a few exceptional individuals in distant historical periods. Every person possessed some capacity for this kind of moral clarity, though it might be developed to very different degrees. The goal of education, both individual and communal, was to cultivate this capacity as fully as possible in every member of society. This democratic dimension of Maimonides' thought becomes especially clear in his approach to religious education. While he recognized that not everyone could achieve the same level of philosophical sophistication, he insisted that everyone could develop genuine understanding appropriate to their circumstances and abilities. Religious truth was like a vast garden, with paths suitable for different kinds of travellers, but all leading toward greater appreciation of the beauty and order that governed the whole. The teacher's responsibility was to help each student find the path most appropriate to their particular gifts and circumstances. This required both deep knowledge of the subject matter and sensitive understanding of human psychology. The same truth might need to be communicated through stories for some students, through logical arguments for others, through practical exercises for still others. The wise teacher would have multiple approaches available, and would choose among them based on careful attention to what each individual student actually needed. This pedagogical flexibility reflected Maimonides' broader conviction that wisdom expressed itself differently in different contexts, while remaining essentially the same. Just as water takes the shape of whatever container holds it, while remaining chemically identical, so truth could be communicated through different forms and methods, while preserving its essential content. This understanding had important implications for how Maimonides approached apparent disagreements between different authorities or traditions, rather than assuming that such disagreements necessarily indicated that someone must be completely wrong. He looked for ways that different perspectives might be addressing different aspects of the same underlying reality, or might be appropriate for different audiences or circumstances. His method was always to seek the most charitable interpretation of competing viewpoints, to understand what legitimate concerns might be motivating apparent errors, and to look for syntheses that could preserve the genuine insights of different approaches while eliminating their limitations. This wasn't a matter of diplomatic compromise that weakened all positions equally, but of careful analysis that could often reveal deeper harmonies beneath surface conflicts. The same principle guided Maimonides' approach to the relationship between different forms of knowledge. Rather than seeing philosophy and medicine, law and theology, ethics and politics as separate domains that might conflict with each other, he looked for the underlying unity that connected all genuine forms of understanding. The person who truly grasped any one area of knowledge would naturally be led toward appreciation of how it connected with all the others. This vision of the unity of knowledge provided a framework for what we might call intellectual hospitality. Maimonides could welcome insights from whatever source they came, confident that genuine truth would always prove compatible with other genuine truths. He studied Greek philosophy, Islamic theology, and Jewish tradition with equal seriousness, finding in each tradition resources that could illuminate the others. But this intellectual hospitality wasn't based on relativism or indifference to truth. Maimonides maintained rigorous standards for evaluating different claims and arguments. He was willing to reject ideas that couldn't withstand careful scrutiny, regardless of their source or their popularity. His openness was based on confidence in reason's ability to distinguish truth from error, not on skepticism about whether such distinctions could be made at all. This combination of openness and rigor created a particularly peaceful approach to intellectual disagreement. When confronted with ideas that seemed to conflict with his own convictions, Maimonides didn't respond with anxiety or defensiveness. Instead, he treated such encounters as opportunities to deepen his understanding, either of the competing ideas or of his own position. He was always prepared to modify his views, if presented with compelling reasons, but he was equally prepared to defend them when they proved capable of meeting serious challenges. The serenity that characterized Maimonides' approach to intellectual controversy stemmed from his confidence that reality itself was coherent and knowable. If his understanding of some issue was correct, then careful investigation would eventually vindicate it. If his understanding was incorrect or incomplete, then careful investigation would help him improve it. Either way, the process of honest inquiry would lead toward greater truth and clarity. This trust in the ultimate reliability of careful thinking allowed Maimonides to maintain remarkable equanimity even when dealing with the most challenging questions. Whether he was trying to reconcile apparent contradictions in religious texts, address philosophical objections to traditional beliefs, or develop practical solutions to complex legal problems, he approached each challenge with the same methodical patience and quiet confidence. His letters reveal someone who took intellectual difficulties seriously without being overwhelmed by them. He would spend years working on particularly complex problems, consulting multiple sources, considering various solutions, and refining his understanding through extensive discussion with other scholars. But throughout this process, he maintained the perspective of someone engaged in a fundamentally worthwhile activity that would eventually lead to beneficial results. This long-term perspective was crucial to Maimonides' ability to sustain intensive intellectual work over many decades. He understood that genuine understanding developed gradually through sustained engagement with important questions. Quick solutions were often superficial solutions, while problems that initially seemed intractable often yielded to patient, systematic investigation. The same developmental understanding shaped his approach to personal spiritual growth. Maimonides recognized that the kind of wisdom he advocated couldn't be achieved overnight or through any single dramatic experience. It required what he called habituation, the gradual formation of intellectual and moral dispositions through repeated practice over extended periods of time. This meant that the path toward wisdom was itself a form of wisdom practice. How one approached the journey was as important as reaching any particular destination along the way. The person who tried to force rapid progress or who became discouraged by temporary setbacks would likely miss opportunities for the kind of deep learning that could only occur through patient, sustained effort. Maimonides developed this insight into a sophisticated understanding of how character formation actually worked. Virtues couldn't be acquired simply by deciding to possess them, or by performing virtuous actions mechanically. They developed through what he called intelligent practice, repeated engagement with situations that required moral choice, guided by clear understanding of what genuine virtue involved. This process required both external guidance from wise teachers and internal reflection on one's own experience. The developing person needed to understand not just what they should do in particular circumstances, but why such actions served genuine human good. Without this understanding, apparent virtue would remain superficial and unreliable, likely to collapse under pressure or to become rigid and legalistic. The integration of understanding and practice that Maimonides advocated created a particularly sustainable approach to moral development. Rather than relying on willpower alone to maintain good behaviour, the person who truly grasped the reasons for virtue would find virtuous action increasingly natural and attractive. They would choose good not because they had to, but because they recognised it as genuinely good. This transformation of motivation was central to Maimonides' understanding of human freedom. True freedom wasn't the ability to choose arbitrarily among different options, but the capacity to choose intelligently based on clear understanding of what would actually serve human flourishing. The person who achieved this kind of freedom would find that their choices became simultaneously more determined and more liberated. More determined because they would be guided by rational principles rather than by random impulses or external pressures. More liberated because they would no longer be enslaved to confused desires or mistaken beliefs about what would make them happy. They would act from their own deepest nature rather than from superficial aspects of personality that didn't represent their true identity. This understanding of freedom had profound implications for how Maimonides thought about moral responsibility and divine providence. Human beings were fully responsible for their choices precisely because they possessed the capacity for the kind of understanding that could guide those choices wisely. At the same time, divine providence operated through the natural consequences of human decisions rather than through arbitrary interventions that overrode human agency. The result was a vision of reality in which human freedom and divine sovereignty complemented rather than conflicted with each other. The more clearly people understood their situation and their options, the more likely they were to make choices that aligned with divine purposes. The person who achieved genuine wisdom would find themselves naturally cooperating with the same principles that governed the entire universe. This cosmic perspective provided the ultimate foundation for the kind of intellectual peace that characterizes all of Maimonides' mature work. Individual human lives, however important they might be from a personal standpoint, were part of a much larger pattern that extended across space and time. Understanding one's place within this larger pattern could provide both humility about one's own significance and confidence about the ultimate meaningfulness of existence. The wise person would care deeply about their own choices and their consequences for others, but they would hold these concerns within a framework of understanding that prevented them from becoming sources of ultimate anxiety. They would work diligently to fulfill their responsibilities while recognizing that the final outcome of their efforts depended on factors beyond their control. This balance between engagement and detachment runs through all aspects of Maimonides' philosophy, creating a distinctive tone of serene involvement that makes his work particularly suitable for quiet contemplation. Here was someone who cared passionately about truth, justice, and human welfare, but who held these concerns lightly enough to pursue them with patience and joy rather than with desperate urgency or paralyzing worry. As we allow these gentle currents of his thought to carry us toward the deeper waters of rest, we can sense how Maimonides' example offers something especially valuable to minds troubled by the apparent urgency and complexity of contemporary life. His approach suggests that the most important work often proceeds most effectively when undertaken with the kind of calm persistence that trusts in the ultimate reliability of careful effort, guided by clear understanding. The integration of intellectual rigour and spiritual serenity that characterised his entire career points toward possibilities for human flourishing that transcend the false choices between thought and feeling, individual development and social responsibility, temporal engagement and eternal perspective. In Maimonides' vision, these apparent opposites become partners in a dance of understanding that can transform both the dancer and the world in which the dance unfolds. His legacy reminds us that the human mind, when properly cultivated and oriented, can become a source of peace rather than anxiety, of connection rather than isolation, of hope rather than despair. The same capacity that allows us to recognize problems and difficulties also equips us to understand them clearly and respond to them wisely. The key lies not in avoiding the challenges of existence, but in approaching them with the right combination of intellectual honesty, moral commitment, and patient trust in the ultimate intelligibility and goodness of reality itself. This profound trust in the harmony between human nature and ultimate reality becomes even more evident when we explore Maimonides' understanding of what he called the intellectual love of God. This wasn't merely an abstract philosophical concept for him, but the culmination of human spiritual development, the state in which all the various threads of knowledge, virtue, and contemplation finally wove themselves into a single, luminous whole. The person who achieved this intellectual love would find themselves in a curious position. They would be simultaneously more aware of their own limitations and more confident in their ability to understand, more conscious of how much remained unknown and more grateful for what had been revealed, more humble about their own achievements, and more appreciative of the magnificent order that made those achievements possible. This paradoxical state reflected what Maimonides saw as the natural outcome of genuine philosophical inquiry. The deeper one penetrated into the nature of reality, the more one realized both the vastness of what could be known and the extraordinary privilege of being able to know anything at all. Knowledge bred not arrogance but wonder, not possessiveness but gratitude. Consider how peaceful this makes the entire enterprise of learning and understanding. There's no need to anxiety about whether we'll ever know enough, whether our insights are adequate, whether we're making sufficient progress. The very capacity to ask such questions, to recognize our limitations and desire to transcend them, is itself a participation in the divine wisdom that governs all existence. Maimonides developed this insight into what became perhaps his most distinctive contribution to medieval philosophy, the idea that the ultimate goal of human existence was not some future reward or punishment, but the present activity of understanding itself. The person who truly grasped the nature of reality was already participating in the highest form of happiness available to human beings. This didn't mean that other forms of satisfaction were worthless, or that practical concerns could be ignored. Maimonides maintained throughout his career the importance of physical health, social relationships, professional competence, and moral behaviour. But he understood all of these as either preparations for or expressions of the fundamental human calling to know and understand. The integration of different levels of human activity around this central purpose created what we might call a hierarchy of goods: material prosperity, social recognition, even moral virtue were genuine goods that deserved appropriate attention and effort. But they were instrumental goods, valuable primarily because they created conditions in which the higher activities of mind and spirit could flourish. This hierarchical understanding allowed Maimonides to maintain a remarkably balanced attitude toward the ordinary concerns of human life. He could take them seriously without taking them too seriously, could work diligently for their achievement without being devastated by their loss, could appreciate their genuine value without confusing them with ultimate value. His letters reveal someone who faced the same practical challenges that confront every human being: financial pressures, health problems, difficult relationships, professional disappointments, political uncertainties. But throughout all these challenges, he maintained the perspective of someone whose deepest satisfaction came from sources that couldn't be threatened by external circumstances. This inner stability wasn't based on emotional detachment or philosophical indifference. Maimonides cared deeply about outcomes in the world and worked tirelessly to improve conditions for himself and others. But his caring was held within a framework of understanding that prevented it from becoming a source of ultimate anxiety or despair. The framework was provided by his conviction that reality itself was structured in such a way that genuine human flourishing was always possible for those who understood what flourishing actually involved. The universe wasn't neutral or hostile to human aspirations, but was designed to support the highest forms of human development for those willing to align themselves with its fundamental patterns. This cosmic optimism might seem naive to contemporary readers accustomed to more skeptical perspectives on human nature and historical possibility. But Maimonides' optimism was grounded not in wishful thinking, but in careful observation of how the world actually worked. He'd seen repeatedly how clear thinking could resolve apparently intractable problems, how moral behaviour could create conditions for mutual flourishing, how patient effort could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. His medical practice reinforced this practical optimism daily. He witnessed regularly how proper understanding of natural processes could restore health, how appropriate interventions could alleviate suffering, how the human body's own wisdom could heal itself when given adequate support. The same principles that governed physical healing, he believed, could guide spiritual and social healing as well. This therapeutic understanding of wisdom appears throughout Maimonides' approach to both individual and communal problems. Rather than seeing difficulties as evidence of fundamental flaws in human nature or cosmic design, he treated them as symptoms of misunderstanding that could be corrected through proper diagnosis and treatment. The method was always the same: careful observation of what was actually happening, identification of the underlying principles involved, development of interventions that worked with, rather than against natural processes, and patient application of appropriate remedies over whatever time was required for healing to occur. This medical model provided a particularly hopeful framework for approaching even the most serious forms of human confusion and conflict. Just as physical diseases, however severe, were still susceptible to treatment when properly understood, so intellectual and moral disorders could be addressed through appropriate forms of education and practice. The key was maintaining confidence that healing was possible, while accepting that it might require considerable time and effort. Maimonides had learned from his medical practice that premature interventions often did more harm than good, that lasting cures usually developed gradually, and that the patient's own understanding and cooperation were essential elements in any successful treatment. The same principles guided his approach to teaching and writing. Rather than trying to force rapid conversions to his point of view, he created conditions in which readers could discover truth for themselves through their own careful thinking. Rather than overwhelming students with more information than they could assimilate, he provided guidance appropriate to their current level of development, while pointing toward possibilities of future growth. This pedagogical patience reflected Maimonides' deeper understanding of how genuine transformation actually occurred. It wasn't enough for people to accept correct conclusions if they hadn't developed the capacity to understand why those conclusions were correct. Without this understanding, apparent agreement would remain superficial and unreliable, likely to collapse when challenged by alternative perspectives or difficult circumstances. True education, therefore, had to be concerned not just with transmitting information, but with developing the intellectual and moral capacities that would enable students to think clearly for themselves. This was a much more ambitious project than simple indoctrination, but it was also much more likely to produce lasting results. The patience required for this kind of education was itself a form of wisdom practice. The teacher who truly cared about students' welfare would resist the temptation to provide easy answers that might satisfy immediate curiosity but wouldn't promote genuine understanding. They would be willing to let students struggle with difficult questions, confident that the struggle itself was an essential part of the learning process. Maimonides' own willingness to address the most challenging intellectual problems of his time exemplified this educational philosophy. Rather than avoiding questions that might disturb conventional beliefs, he engaged them directly, confident that honest inquiry would ultimately strengthen rather than undermine genuine faith. His approach to the relationship between philosophy and religion became a model for how apparently competing authorities could be brought into creative dialogue. Instead of choosing sides in debates between reason and revelation, he showed how each could illuminate the limitations and possibilities of the other. This synthetic approach required what we might call intellectual courage, the willingness to follow arguments wherever they led while maintaining commitment to the deepest values that gave life meaning and direction. It demanded both rigorous honesty about what could and couldn't be demonstrated through rational inquiry and humble openness to sources of wisdom that transcended the boundaries of any single method or tradition. The result was a form of intellectual maturity that could appreciate the genuine insights of different approaches while recognizing their limitations. Maimonides could value both the careful observations of Aristotelian natural philosophy and the profound spiritual insights of biblical tradition without feeling compelled to reduce either to the other. This mature integration of different forms of knowledge created a particularly stable foundation for ongoing intellectual development. Rather than being threatened by new discoveries or alternative perspectives, someone who had achieved this integration would welcome them as opportunities to deepen and refine their understanding. The same openness to growth and correction that characterized Maimonides' intellectual method also shaped his understanding of moral development. He recognized that genuine virtue couldn't be achieved through rigid adherence to external rules, but required the kind of practical wisdom that could adapt universal principles to particular circumstances. This meant that moral education, like intellectual education, had to be concerned with developing capacities for judgment, rather than simply transmitting correct behaviors. The person who truly understood what justice or compassion required would be able to recognize how these virtues should be expressed even in unprecedented situations. But developing this kind of moral perception required extensive practice with the complexities of actual human relationships. It couldn't be learned from abstract principles alone, though principles could provide essential guidance. It demanded what Maimonides called habituation, the gradual formation of character through repeated engagement with situations that required moral choice. This process of moral habituation was closely connected to Maimonides' understanding of how human beings could participate in divine wisdom. By learning to see clearly what genuine human flourishing required and by developing the motivation and capacity to serve that flourishing, individuals could align themselves with the same purposes that governed the entire universe. The person who achieved this alignment would find themselves in the remarkable position of acting freely while serving necessity, pursuing their own deepest interests while contributing to the common good, expressing their individual nature while participating in universal patterns. This integration of freedom and order, individuality and universality was the ultimate goal of all education and development in Maimonides' understanding. It represented the fulfillment of human potential, the state in which all the various capacities of human nature work together harmoniously in service of their proper ends. The path toward this fulfillment was open to everyone, though different people would travel it in different ways and reach different levels of achievement. What mattered wasn't achieving some predetermined standard of excellence, but making genuine progress appropriate to one's particular circumstances and abilities. This democratic dimension of Maimonides' vision provided a foundation for hope that extended far beyond individual development. If every person possessed some capacity for wisdom and virtue, then every community contained resources for improvement that could be cultivated through appropriate education and leadership. The wise society would be one that recognized and nurtured these capacities in all its members, creating conditions in which different forms of excellence could flourish while contributing to shared purposes. Such a society wouldn't eliminate differences in ability or achievement, but it would ensure that those differences serve the common good, rather than creating unjust divisions or sources of conflict. Maimonides' own career illustrated how this vision might be realized in practice. As a physician, he served the immediate physical needs of his patients regardless of their social status or personal characteristics. As a legal authority, he provided guidance that helped communities maintain order and justice while adapting to changing circumstances. As a philosopher, he addressed the deepest questions that troubled thoughtful believers while remaining accessible to readers with varying levels of preparation. Throughout all these activities, he maintained the perspective of someone engaged in fundamentally cooperative work. His individual achievements were valuable not as personal accomplishments, but as contributions to the larger human project of understanding and serving the divine purposes that governed all existence. This understanding of individual achievement as essentially communal in its significance provided a particularly peaceful framework for approaching questions of recognition and legacy. Maimonides could work diligently to develop his own capacities and complete his various projects while remaining relatively indifferent to whether his contributions received appropriate acknowledgement or historical influence. What mattered was not personal recognition, but faithful service to truth and human welfare. If his work proved helpful to others, that was a source of gratitude rather than pride. If it was ignored or misunderstood, that was unfortunate, but didn't diminish its intrinsic value or his satisfaction in having completed it according to his best understanding. This serene approach to achievement and recognition reflected Maimonides' deeper conviction that genuine success couldn't be measured by external standards alone. The person who had truly understood their place in the larger order of reality would find their primary satisfaction in the intrinsic excellence of their work rather than in its reception by others. This didn't mean becoming indifferent to outcomes in the world or losing concern for whether one's efforts proved effective. Maimonides cared deeply about results and worked carefully to ensure that his various projects served their intended purposes, but he held these concerns within a framework of understanding that prevented them from becoming sources of anxiety or despair. The framework was provided by his trust in the ultimate intelligibility and goodness of reality itself. If his understanding of some situation was correct and his response was appropriate, then his efforts would contribute positively to the larger patterns that governed existence, regardless of whether their contribution was immediately visible or widely acknowledged. If his understanding was incomplete or his response was inadequate, then the consequences would provide opportunities for learning and correction that could guide future efforts. Either way, honest engagement with important questions would prove worthwhile, even when it didn't achieve all that had been hoped. This long-term perspective allowed Maimonides to maintain remarkable persistence and equanimity, even when working on problems that resisted quick solutions, or when facing opposition from people who misunderstood his intentions. He approached each challenge with the patience of someone engaged in essentially eternal work, important enough to justify whatever effort was required, but not dependent on immediate success for its ultimate value. The same perspective shaped his understanding of how individual lives related to the larger sweep of history. Human beings were privileged to participate in purposes that extended far beyond their own brief existence, but they weren't responsible for completing those purposes single-handedly or within their own lifetimes. This recognition provided a foundation for what we might call historical humility, the ability to work diligently for important goals, while accepting that one's own contribution would necessarily be partial and preliminary. The wise person could plant seeds confident that others would tend and harvest them, could begin projects confident that others would continue and complete them. But this historical humility didn't lead to passivity or indifference. If anything, It intensified the importance of making whatever contribution one could during the time available. The person who truly grasped their place in the larger story would work more diligently, not less diligently, because they understood how much depended on each individual's faithful service to purposes greater than themselves. As the gentle currents of this exploration begin to merge with the deeper tides of approaching sleep, we can sense how Maimonides' vision offers something particularly valuable to minds troubled by questions of meaning and purpose. Here was someone who found in the apparent complexity and difficulty of existence not reasons for despair, but invitations to understanding, not evidence of cosmic indifference, but glimpses of profound order and care. His example suggests that the human mind, when properly oriented and patiently developed, can discover in reality itself the resources needed for both understanding and peace. The same questions that initially seem threatening or overwhelming can become sources of wonder and gratitude when approached with the right combination of intellectual honesty and spiritual trust. The legacy of Maimonides reminds us that wisdom is not a destination to be reached, but a way of travelling, not a possession to be acquired, but a relationship to be cultivated, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be entered more and more deeply. The person who truly grasps this understanding finds in the very process of seeking a foretaste of what is sought, in the journey itself a glimpse of the destination that gives it meaning and direction. His life and work stand as testimony to the possibility of human flourishing, even in the midst of uncertainty and change, of intellectual clarity even when surrounded by confusion and conflict, of spiritual peace even while fully engaged with the urgent questions and practical needs of one's own historical moment. The integration he achieved between contemplation and action, individual development and communal service, temporal engagement and eternal perspective, points toward possibilities for human existence that transcend the false choices that often seem to constrain our options. In the quiet spaces where philosophy meets faith, where reason discovers its own deepest sources and highest aspirations, where the human mind recognizes itself as participant in rather than mere observer of the ultimate mystery that encompasses all existence, we find the gentle wisdom that made Maimonides not just a great thinker, but a true guide for anyone seeking to understand their place in the vast, patient, luminous order that holds us all. As these reflections settle into the deeper rhythms of rest, we can carry with us the peaceful confidence that animated all of Maimonides' work, that reality is ultimately trustworthy, that human beings are equipped to understand their situation and respond appropriately, and that the careful, patient pursuit of truth and goodness will lead naturally toward the kinds of understanding and peace that make existence not just bearable, but deeply satisfying. The same mind that can recognize problems can also discover solutions. The same heart that can feel confusion can also find clarity, and the same soul that seeks meaning can also find it, written into the very structure of a universe that welcomes rather than resists our deepest aspirations for knowledge, virtue, and joy. The profound integration that Maimonides achieved between intellectual rigor and spiritual serenity becomes even more remarkable when we consider his understanding of time itself. For him, temporal existence wasn't simply a series of disconnected moments, but a flowing continuum in which past wisdom, present understanding, and future possibility converged into something approaching the eternal perspective that he believed characterized divine knowledge. And this temporal integration appears throughout his approach to both individual development and communal life. The person seeking wisdom couldn't simply focus on immediate concerns or distant goals, but needed to understand how present choices connected to larger patterns that extended across generations. Every decision carried implications that rippled forward and backward through time, connecting the individual to ancestors who had wrestled with similar questions, and to descendants who would inherit the consequences of contemporary choices. Consider how peaceful this makes our relationship to the apparent urgency of daily life. Rather than being overwhelmed by the pressure to solve every problem immediately or achieve every goal within our own brief span of years, we can locate our efforts within larger rhythms that allow for patient, sustained engagement with important questions. The work of understanding and wisdom building becomes less frantic and more contemplative, less driven by anxiety about outcomes, and more sustained by appreciation for the intrinsic value of the work itself. Maimonides developed this temporal perspective through his deep engagement with what he called the chain of tradition, the way wisdom was transmitted across generations through careful study, thoughtful interpretation, and lived experience. He understood himself as a link in this chain, receiving insights from earlier thinkers and preparing them for transmission to future seekers. This understanding provided both humility about his own achievements and confidence about their lasting value. The metaphor of the chain suggests something particularly beautiful about how knowledge develops over time. Each generation doesn't start from scratch, but inherits accumulated wisdom that has been tested, refined, and deepened through centuries of careful thought. At the same time, each generation faces new questions and circumstances that require fresh applications of traditional insights. The process involves both conservation and innovation, both faithfulness to what has proven valuable and creativity in addressing what is genuinely new. This balance between tradition and innovation appears throughout Maimonides' major works. His legal writings demonstrate profound respect for established authorities, while showing remarkable creativity in applying traditional principles to unprecedented situations. His philosophical works engage seriously with inherited questions, while introducing conceptual distinctions and synthetic insights that would influence thinking for centuries to come. The same balance shaped his understanding of how individual minds should relate to the broader intellectual community. The person seeking wisdom couldn't simply rely on their own reasoning, but needed to engage seriously with the insights of others, both contemporary and historical. At the same time, genuine understanding required personal appropriation of inherited wisdom, making it one's own through careful thought and lived experience. This communal dimension of intellectual development created what Maimonides saw as a natural form of intellectual humility. The individual mind, however gifted, could grasp only fragments of the truth that emerged through sustained collective inquiry across many generations. Recognition of this limitation didn't lead to skepticism about the possibility of knowledge, but to gratitude for the opportunity to participate in something much larger than any individual achievement. The wisdom traditions that nurtured Maimonides had developed sophisticated methods for ensuring that this collective inquiry remained productive rather than simply accumulative. Not every opinion carried equal weight, and not every innovation represented genuine progress. The community of seekers needed criteria for distinguishing authentic insights from mere novelties, lasting contributions from passing fashions. Maimonides contributed to this evaluative process through what we might call his principle of intellectual coherence. Ideas that truly advanced understanding would prove compatible with other well-established truths, would illuminate previously puzzling questions, and would generate further insights when carefully developed. Ideas that created more problems than they solved, that required abandoning other well-founded convictions, or that led to intellectual dead ends were probably mistaken, regardless of their initial appeal or their source. This principle provided a particularly stable foundation for navigating the inevitable disagreements that arose within any living intellectual tradition. Rather than being paralyzed by the existence of competing viewpoints, or concluding that all opinions were equally valid, Maimonides could engage different perspectives confidently, testing them against established criteria while remaining open to the possibility that his own understanding might need revision. The process of intellectual evaluation that Maimonides advocated was itself a form of contemplative practice. It required patient attention to details, careful consideration of alternatives, and willingness to suspend judgment until sufficient evidence had been gathered. It demanded both analytical precision and synthetic imagination, the ability to break complex questions into manageable parts, and to see how those parts fit together into larger wholes. Most importantly, it required what Maimonides called intellectual courage, the willingness to follow arguments wherever they led, even when they challenged comfortable assumptions or popular beliefs. This courage wasn't reckless or destructive, but was guided by confidence that truth itself was more valuable than any particular beliefs about truth, and that genuine understanding would prove more satisfying than the illusion of understanding. This commitment to intellectual honesty, however demanding it might be in particular cases, created the conditions for what Maimonides considered the highest form of human happiness. The person who truly grasped important aspects of reality would find in that understanding a satisfaction that couldn't be threatened by external circumstances or diminished by the passage of time. The happiness that came from genuine knowledge wasn't dependent on whether others recognized one's achievements, whether one's insights proved practically useful, or whether one lived to see their full development. It was intrinsic to the activity of understanding itself, a participation in the divine wisdom that governed all existence, a sharing in the eternal perspective that saw all temporal events within their proper context. This understanding of intellectual happiness as intrinsically satisfying rather than instrumentally valuable transformed Maimonides' approach to learning and teaching. Knowledge wasn't pursued primarily for its practical applications, though such applications were welcome when they appeared. It was pursued for its own sake, as a form of participation in what was most fundamental and enduring about reality. The same principle applied to moral development and spiritual practice. Virtuous action and contemplative discipline weren't primarily means to achieving some future reward, but were intrinsically valuable expressions of human nature operating according to its proper principles. The person who truly understood what virtue involved would choose it not because it led to beneficial consequences, but because it represented the natural fulfillment of human capacities. This intrinsic understanding of value created a particularly sustainable approach to both intellectual and moral development. Rather than depending on external motivation that might weaken under pressure or disappear when circumstances changed, the person who grasped the inherent worth of wisdom and virtue would find their commitment strengthened by every genuine achievement in understanding or character. Maimonides' own career illustrated this sustainable approach to human development. Despite facing enormous practical pressures and multiple competing demands on his time and energy, he maintained consistent dedication to intellectual work and moral excellence throughout his long life. His productivity didn't decline with age or diminish under stress, but seemed to deepen and become more focused as he gained experience and perspective. This consistency stemmed from his understanding that the highest human activities were also the most natural human activities. The person who truly grasped their own nature would find that pursuing wisdom and virtue required less effort over time, not more, because these pursuits aligned with, rather than conflicted with, their deepest inclinations and aspirations. The alignment between human nature and highest human activities provided the foundation for what Maimonides called the life of contemplation. This wasn't a withdrawal from ordinary human concerns, but a way of engaging those concerns from the perspective of someone who understood their place within larger patterns of meaning and value. The contemplative person would still maintain family relationships, pursue professional responsibilities, and participate in community life. But these activities would be held within a framework of understanding that prevented them from becoming sources of ultimate anxiety or exclusive focus. They would be appreciated as genuine goods, while being recognized as instrumental rather than final goods. This hierarchical understanding of different forms of value created space for what we might call practical serenity. The person who grasped what ultimately mattered could engage wholeheartedly with immediate concerns while maintaining perspective about their relative importance. They could work diligently for achievable goals while accepting that some outcomes remained beyond their control. The serenity that characterized Maimonides' approach to practical problems wasn't based on emotional detachment or philosophical indifference. He cared deeply about results in the world and invested considerable effort in trying to improve conditions for himself and others. but his caring was informed by understanding of how individual efforts fit into larger patterns that extended far beyond any particular lifetime or historical moment. This cosmic perspective provided a particularly peaceful framework for dealing with frustration, disappointment, and apparent failure. Rather than seeing such experiences as evidence that life was meaningless or that effort was futile, Maimonides understood them as natural aspects of finite existence that didn't negate the overall intelligibility and goodness of reality. The person who truly grasped the nature of temporal existence would expect to encounter obstacles, setbacks, and partial failures. These weren't signs that something had gone wrong with the universe, but were predictable consequences of working within the limitations of particular historical circumstances while serving purposes that transcended those limitations. This acceptance of limitation as natural rather than tragic created space for what Maimonides called joyful perseverance. The wise person could continue working toward important goals even when progress seemed slow or when outcomes remained uncertain. They could maintain hope without requiring guarantees, could sustain effort without demanding immediate success. The joy that animated this perseverance wasn't dependent on achieving particular results, but flowed from participation in activities that were inherently worthwhile. The person engaged in genuine inquiry, authentic moral development, or meaningful service to others was already experiencing a form of success that couldn't be taken away by external circumstances. This understanding of success as intrinsic to right activity, rather than dependent on external outcomes, provided a foundation for remarkable resilience in the face of difficulty. Maimonides himself demonstrated this resilience repeatedly, continuing productive work even during periods of exile, persecution, and overwhelming professional demands. His letters from particularly challenging periods reveal someone who acknowledged real difficulties while maintaining fundamental optimism about the possibility of meaningful response to those difficulties. He didn't minimize problems or pretend that they weren't genuinely troubling, but he approached them with confidence that patient, intelligent effort would eventually lead to some form of resolution, or at least of valuable learning. This combination of realistic assessment and hopeful engagement reflected Maimonides' deeper conviction that reality itself was structured to support rather than frustrate genuine human aspiration. The universe wasn't designed to make human life easy, but it was designed to make human flourishing possible for those willing to understand and cooperate with its fundamental principles. The cooperation that Maimonides advocated wasn't passive submission to external forces, but active participation in patterns of meaning and purpose that connected individual lives to cosmic purposes. The person who achieved this cooperation would find themselves simultaneously more free and more constrained, more individual and more universal, more engaged with temporal concerns and more connected to eternal values. This paradoxical integration of apparent opposites was, for Maimonides, the natural outcome of genuine wisdom. The mind that truly understood reality wouldn't be torn between competing loyalties or forced to choose between incompatible goods, but would discover underlying harmonies that made apparent contradictions into complementary aspects of larger wholes. The discovery of these harmonies required what Maimonides called philosophical patience, the willingness to live with questions that couldn't be answered immediately, and to work toward understanding that might develop only gradually over extended periods. This patience wasn't resignation or passivity, but was grounded in confidence that reality was ultimately intelligible, and that sustained inquiry would eventually yield genuine insights. The same patience that guided intellectual inquiry also shaped Maimonides' approach to moral development and spiritual practice. Character formation couldn't be rushed, and authentic spiritual insight couldn't be forced. Both required what he called intelligent habituation, repeated engagement with appropriate activities, guided by clear understanding of their purpose and proper performance. This understanding of development as requiring both time and intelligence created a particularly balanced approach to personal growth. The person seeking wisdom or virtue couldn't simply rely on good intentions or emotional enthusiasm, but needed to understand what they were trying to achieve and why their chosen methods were appropriate for achieving it. At the same time, understanding alone wasn't sufficient. Genuine development required practice, the gradual formation of new capacities through repeated engagement with situations that called those capacities into play. The integration of understanding and practice created conditions for the kind of lasting transformation that could withstand pressure and continue developing throughout an entire lifetime. Maimonides' own integration of theoretical and practical wisdom provided a compelling example of how this developmental process might unfold. His philosophical insights weren't separated from his medical practice, legal work, or community leadership, but were informed by these practical engagements with human needs and problems. The result was a form of wisdom that was simultaneously abstract and concrete, universal and particular, eternal and temporal. It could address the most fundamental questions about the nature of reality while providing practical guidance for specific decisions in particular circumstances. This synthetic achievement wasn't simply a matter of individual brilliance, but reflected Maimonides' participation in intellectual and spiritual traditions that had been developing for centuries before his birth, and would continue developing for centuries after his death. His greatness lay not in creating something entirely new, but in receiving inherited wisdom gratefully and transmitting it faithfully, while contributing his own insights to the ongoing collective inquiry. The humility that characterized this understanding of individual achievement within larger traditions created a particularly peaceful relationship to questions of recognition and legacy. Maimonides could work diligently to develop his own capacities and complete important projects while remaining relatively detached from concerns about how his contributions would be received or remembered. What mattered wasn't personal recognition, but faithful service to truth and human welfare. If his work proved helpful to others, that was a source of gratitude rather than pride. If it was misunderstood or forgotten, that was unfortunate but didn't diminish its intrinsic value or his satisfaction in having completed it according to his best understanding of what was needed. This serene approach to achievement reflected Maimonides' deeper understanding of how individual lives related to the eternal purposes that gave them meaning and direction. Human beings were privileged to participate in something far greater than themselves, but their participation was valuable regardless of its scope or visibility. The person who contributed faithfully within their own sphere of influence was serving the same ultimate purposes as those whose contributions had wider recognition or more obvious historical impact. The democratic implications of this understanding provided hope that extended far beyond questions of individual achievement. If every person possessed some capacity for wisdom and virtue, and if even small contributions could serve eternal purposes, then every community contained resources for improvement that could be developed through appropriate education and leadership. The wise society would recognize and nurture these distributed capacities while providing frameworks within which different forms of excellence could flourish and contribute to shared goals. Such a society wouldn't eliminate differences in ability or achievement, but would ensure that those differences serve the common good, rather than creating unjust divisions or unnecessary conflicts. As these gentle currents of Maimonides' thought continue to flow through the quiet spaces of approaching rest, we can sense how his vision offers something particularly valuable to minds seeking both understanding and peace. Here was someone who found in the apparent complexity of existence not reasons for confusion, but invitations to deeper comprehension, not evidence of meaninglessness, but glimpses of profound purpose and order. His example suggests that the human mind, when properly cultivated and patiently developed, can become a source of clarity rather than confusion, of connection rather than isolation, of hope rather than despair. The same capacity that allows us to recognize problems and difficulties also equips us to understand them more clearly and respond to them more wisely. The key lies not in avoiding the challenges of existence, but in approaching them with the right combination of intellectual honesty, moral commitment, and patient trust in the ultimate reliability of careful inquiry guided by genuine concern for truth and human flourishing. The legacy of Maimonides continues to whisper across the centuries, reminding us that wisdom is not a destination to be reached, but a way of travelling, not a possession to be acquired, but a relationship to be cultivated, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be entered more and more deeply. In that gentle entering, in that patient cultivation, in that faithful travelling, we find not final answers but better questions, not complete understanding but clearer vision, not perfect peace but deeper trust in the ultimate harmony that holds all things together in patterns too vast and beautiful for any finite mind to grasp completely, yet intimate enough to touch every moment of sincere seeking with something approaching the eternal joy that flows from participating, however briefly and partially, in the endless conversation between human longing and divine wisdom. As we drift deeper into the gentle embrace of contemplation, we find ourselves drawn to perhaps the most intimate aspect of Maimonides' philosophy, his understanding of prayer and the human soul's relationship with the divine. For him, prayer wasn't merely a ritual obligation or a method of requesting favours from above, but the most natural expression of a mind that had begun to grasp the extraordinary nature of existence itself. Consider how radically this transforms our understanding of what prayer actually is. Rather than seeing it as a kind of cosmic transaction, where we offer praise in exchange for benefits, Maimonides understood prayer as the soul's natural response to recognizing its place within the vast, intricate web of reality. It was less about asking for things, and more about acknowledging the overwhelming gift of being able to ask at all. This recognition led him to develop what might be called a philosophy of gratitude that permeated every aspect of his thinking. The person who truly understood their situation, who grasped even dimly the remarkable fact that consciousness had emerged from matter, that minds could know truth, that hearts could feel beauty, would find themselves spontaneously moved to something approaching worship, not the anxious worship of someone trying to appease an unpredictable deity, but the joyful worship of someone who had glimpsed the extraordinary elegance of the system within which they found themselves. The prayers that emerged from this understanding would have a different quality entirely. They would be less concerned with changing external circumstances and more focused on aligning internal attitudes with the reality that prayer helped reveal. The person who prayed with genuine understanding would find themselves gradually transformed by the activity itself, becoming more patient, more grateful, more aware of their connections to everything around them. Maimonides developed this insight into a sophisticated understanding of what he called the levels of prayer. Just as religious texts could communicate truth at different depths, depending on the reader's preparation, so prayer could function at different levels of meaning and effectiveness depending on the prayer's understanding and intention. At its simplest level, prayer provided comfort and community, connecting individuals to traditions that had sustained people through countless generations of difficulty and change. Even someone who didn't fully grasp the theological or philosophical dimensions of what they were doing could benefit from participating in practices that had been refined through centuries of use by people seeking wisdom, strength, and direction. At a deeper level, prayer became a form of meditation, a way of focusing attention on questions and values that might otherwise be overwhelmed by the immediate pressures of daily life. The regular rhythm of prayer created space for reflection, for stepping back from urgent concerns and reconnecting with longer-term purposes and commitments. At its deepest level, prayer became what Maimonides called intellectual communion, a form of conscious participation in the divine wisdom that governed all existence. The person who achieved this level of prayer would find themselves simultaneously more humble and more confident, more aware of their own limitations and more grateful for their capacity to transcend those limitations through understanding. This progression through different levels of prayer reflected Maimonides' broader understanding of how spiritual development actually worked. It wasn't a matter of dramatic conversion experiences or sudden mystical insights, though such experiences might occasionally occur. More typically, it involved gradual deepening of appreciation for realities that had always been present but hadn't been clearly recognized. The same principle applied to what Maimonides called the cultivation of wonder. He believed that one of the most important capacities human beings possessed was their ability to be astonished by ordinary things when seen clearly. The person who truly looked at a flower, or contemplated the movement of stars, or considered the complexity of their own consciousness, would find themselves face to face with mysteries that no amount of scientific explanation could entirely dissolve. This capacity for wonder wasn't something that needed to be created from scratch, but was a natural human endowment that could be either cultivated or neglected. Children possessed it naturally, which was why they could spend hours fascinated by things that adults had learned to take for granted. The goal of wisdom wasn't to outgrow this childlike wonder, but to refine it, to develop more sophisticated appreciation for increasingly subtle forms of beauty and meaning. Maimonides found this cultivated wonder to be one of the most reliable sources of what he called natural piety. The person who maintained the capacity to be genuinely astonished by existence would find themselves naturally inclined toward gratitude, humility, and care for the remarkable world that had given rise to their capacity for astonishment in the first place. This natural piety didn't require adherence to any particular religious tradition, though it was compatible with, and could be deepened by such adherence. It was more fundamental than specific beliefs or practices arising directly from clear perception of what was actually the case, rather than from cultural conditioning or emotional needs. The universality of this natural piety provided a foundation for what Maimonides saw as the ultimate unity underlying apparent religious diversity. Different traditions might use different languages, ceremonies, and conceptual frameworks, but they were all responding to the same fundamental realities that evoked wonder and gratitude in anyone who perceived them clearly. This didn't mean that all religious traditions were equally adequate, or that differences between them didn't matter. Maimonides maintained throughout his career that some approaches to spiritual development were more effective than others, that some beliefs were more accurate than others, and that some practices were more conducive to genuine growth than others. But he also recognized that the same ultimate truths could be approached through different paths, and that what worked best for one person in one set of circumstances might not be optimal for another person in different circumstances. The key was maintaining focus on the underlying realities that all genuine spiritual traditions were trying to help people recognize and appreciate. This inclusive understanding of spiritual truth allowed Maimonides to maintain both strong commitment to his own tradition and generous appreciation for insights that emerged from other sources. He could value the particular wisdom of Jewish teaching while learning from Islamic philosophy, Greek science, and any other source that offered genuine illumination. The same principle guided his approach to what we might call interfaith dialogue, though that term wouldn't have been familiar to him. When engaged in discussion with people from different religious backgrounds, Maimonides looked for common ground in shared commitment to truth, justice, and human flourishing rather than focusing primarily on doctrinal differences. This didn't mean minimizing real disagreements or pretending that all perspectives were equally valid, but it did mean approaching such discussions with curiosity about what might be learned rather than with primary concern for defending predetermined positions. The person who was genuinely confident in their own understanding could afford to be generous in considering alternative viewpoints. The intellectual generosity that characterized Maimonides' approach to religious diversity extended to his understanding of how communities should be organized and governed. Rather than advocating for rigid uniformity that would suppress natural differences in ability and inclination, he envisioned societies that could accommodate diversity while maintaining shared commitment to fundamental values. The ideal community, in his understanding, would be like a well-functioning organism in which different parts played different roles while contributing to the health and flourishing of the whole. Some people would be natural leaders, others would excel in various forms of practical work, still others would be particularly gifted in intellectual or artistic pursuits. What mattered wasn't eliminating these differences, but ensuring that they served the common good, rather than creating unnecessary conflicts or injustices. This organic understanding of social organization required what Maimonides called practical wisdom in leadership. Those responsible for guiding communities needed to understand both the general principles that promoted human flourishing and the particular circumstances that shaped how those principles should be applied in specific situations. Such leaders couldn't simply impose abstract ideals without regard for existing conditions and constraints, but neither could they simply accept whatever arrangements happened to exist without considering whether they adequately served human needs and aspirations. The challenge was to work patiently toward better conditions while maintaining stability and avoiding the disruption that came from trying to change too much too quickly. Maimonides' own experience in various leadership roles taught him that this balance between idealism and realism was among the most difficult aspects of practical wisdom to develop. It required both clear vision of what was ultimately desirable and realistic assessment of what was immediately possible, both strong commitment to important values and flexible creativity in finding ways to embody those values under imperfect conditions. The letters he wrote while serving as a communal leader reveal someone who took these responsibilities seriously while maintaining perspective about their limitations. He worked diligently to resolve conflicts, provide guidance on difficult questions, and improve conditions for the communities he served. But he also recognized that lasting change usually required more time and broader cooperation than any individual leader could provide. This realistic understanding of leadership possibilities created space for what we might call patient activism. The person who truly grasped both the importance of social improvement and the constraints within which such improvement had to occur could sustain long-term effort without becoming discouraged by slow progress or temporary setbacks. The same patience that guided Maimonides' approach to social leadership also shaped his understanding of how individuals should relate to their own personal development. Just as communities couldn't be transformed overnight, so personal growth in wisdom and virtue required sustained effort over extended periods of time. This developmental understanding had profound implications for how people should think about their own limitations and failures. Rather than seeing such experiences as evidence of fundamental inadequacy or as reasons for despair, Maimonides understood them as natural aspects of any genuine growth process that could provide valuable information about what kinds of effort and attention were needed. The person who was honestly committed to becoming wiser and more virtuous would inevitably encounter situations that revealed the inadequacy of their current understanding or character. Rather than being crushed by such discoveries, they could treat them as opportunities for targeted improvement, chances to identify specific areas where more learning or practice was needed. This growth-oriented approach to personal limitation created a particularly sustainable framework for long-term development. Instead of requiring perfection or becoming paralyzed by the gap between ideals and current reality, the developing person could maintain steady progress by focusing on whatever next step seemed most important and achievable. Maimonides' own intellectual biography illustrates this incremental approach to growth. His early works show someone already remarkably accomplished, but still developing the synthetic insights and methodological sophistication that would characterize his mature philosophy. Rather than being embarrassed by the limitations of his earlier thinking, he continued to learn and refine his understanding throughout his entire career. The same developmental patience that guided his intellectual work also shaped his approach to moral and spiritual growth. He understood that character formation couldn't be rushed, and that authentic spiritual insight couldn't be forced. Both required what he called intelligent practice, repeated engagement with appropriate activities guided by clear understanding of their purpose and proper execution. This integration of understanding and practice created conditions for the kind of transformation that could withstand pressure and continue developing throughout an entire lifetime. The person who truly grasped why certain activities were valuable and how they should be performed would find those activities increasingly natural and satisfying, rather than burdensome obligations imposed from outside. The joy that emerged from this kind of intelligent practice was itself a sign that one was moving in the right direction. Maimonides believed that genuine virtue and wisdom were inherently attractive to human nature properly understood. The person who was developing authentic excellence would find the process increasingly rewarding, rather than increasingly difficult. This didn't mean that growth would always be easy or that challenges would disappear, but it did mean that the fundamental orientation toward development would become more stable and self-sustaining as understanding deepened and character matured. The person would work toward improvement because they wanted to, not because they felt they had to. The intrinsic motivation that characterized mature development provided a foundation for what Maimonides called joyful discipline. The wise person would maintain regular practices and high standards, not as external impositions, but as natural expressions of their own deepest values and aspirations. This integration of discipline and joy, structure and freedom, effort and satisfaction, was perhaps one of Maimonides' most attractive insights for contemporary readers. He showed that the apparent conflict between what we want to do and what we should do often dissolves when we understand clearly enough what we actually want and why certain activities genuinely serve our deepest interests. The person who achieved this integration would find themselves simultaneously more free and more directed, more spontaneous and more reliable, more individual and more connected to universal values. They would act from their own center, while serving purposes that transcended their personal concerns. As the gentle currents of these explorations continue to carry us toward the deeper waters of rest, we can sense how Maimonides' understanding of human development offers something particularly valuable to minds seeking both growth and peace. Rather than presenting personal improvement as a grim struggle against recalcitrant nature, he showed how it could become a natural unfolding of capacities that wanted to develop when given appropriate conditions and guidance. His vision suggests that the same intelligence that allows us to recognize our limitations also equips us to transcend them gradually and sustainably. The same conscience that makes us aware of moral failures also guides us toward better choices. The same longing that reveals the inadequacy of superficial satisfactions also points us toward deeper sources of fulfillment. The harmony between human nature and human possibilities that Maimonides discovered provides a foundation for approaching personal development with both serious commitment and fundamental confidence. We can work diligently toward becoming better people, while trusting that the process itself, when undertaken with appropriate understanding and patience, will prove intrinsically rewarding rather than merely instrumentally valuable. This trust in the natural compatibility between growth and satisfaction, effort and joy, discipline and freedom, creates space for the kind of patient persistence that genuine transformation requires. We need not be anxious about whether we're progressing quickly enough or achieving the right results. The process itself, when engaged with sincerity and appropriate guidance, will lead naturally toward whatever understanding and character development we're capable of achieving. The same confidence that guided Maimonides' approach to personal development also shaped his understanding of how human beings could participate in what he called the repair of the world. This wasn't simply a matter of individual self-improvement, though such improvement was an essential component. It involved recognizing how personal growth connected to broader patterns of healing and development that could transform entire communities and even civilizations. The person who achieved genuine wisdom and virtue wouldn't remain isolated in private excellence, but would naturally become a source of benefit for others, not necessarily through dramatic public actions, though such actions might sometimes be appropriate, but through the quiet influence of someone who embodied in their own person the kinds of qualities that made human life more beautiful, meaningful, and sustainable. Maimonides understood this influence to operate through what we might call moral contagion, the way that excellence in one person could inspire and enable excellence in others. The individual who had developed genuine patience, wisdom, courage, or compassion didn't have to preach these virtues to others. Their very presence and example could awaken similar capacities in people who might not have realized they possessed them. This understanding of how positive influence actually worked provided a particularly hopeful framework for thinking about social change. Rather than depending entirely on political reforms or institutional changes, though such changes might be valuable, lasting improvement in human communities could emerge through the gradual accumulation of individuals who had done the patient work of developing their own capacities for wisdom and virtue. The process might be slow and often invisible, but it was also more fundamental and sustainable than changes that were imposed from above or that depended on external circumstances remaining favourable. The community that contained even a small number of genuinely wise and virtuous people possessed resources for renewal and growth that couldn't be taken away by political upheavals or economic difficulties. Maimonides' own life provided a compelling example of how this quiet influence could operate across centuries. His immediate impact on his contemporary communities was significant but limited. The full influence of his synthesis of reason and faith, his integration of practical and theoretical wisdom, and his demonstration of how intellectual excellence could serve human flourishing would unfold gradually through the work of countless individuals who found in his example resources for their own development. The same principle applied to how he understood the relationship between individual achievement and cosmic purpose. The person who developed authentic wisdom and virtue was participating in patterns of meaning and value that extended far beyond their own historical moment. Their individual excellence contributed to something much larger than themselves, even when that contribution remained invisible to contemporary observers. This cosmic perspective provided a foundation for what we might call serene engagement with the challenges and opportunities of temporal existence. The person who grasped their place within larger patterns of meaning could work wholeheartedly for improvement in immediate circumstances, while maintaining equanimity about outcomes that remained beyond their control. The serenity that emerged from this understanding wasn't based on indifference to results, or withdrawal from active engagement with problems that needed solutions. Maimonides cared deeply about the welfare of individuals and communities, and invested enormous effort in trying to improve conditions wherever his influence could be helpful. But his caring was held within a framework of understanding that prevented it from becoming a source of ultimate anxiety or despair. He could work diligently toward goals he considered important, while accepting that the final outcomes of his efforts would depend on factors beyond his individual capacity to influence or predict. This balance between engagement and acceptance, between caring and letting go, between working for change and trusting larger processes, created the distinctive tone of peaceful intensity that characterizes all of Maimonides' mature work. Here was someone fully committed to important purposes, but not driven by compulsive need to control results, deeply concerned about human welfare, but not overwhelmed by the magnitude of problems that needed attention. The source of this balanced engagement lay in Maimonides' conviction that reality itself was structured in ways that supported rather than frustrated genuine human aspiration. The universe might not make human life easy, but it was designed to make human flourishing possible for those willing to understand and cooperate with its fundamental principles. This meant that honest effort directed toward worthy goals would always prove meaningful, even when it didn't achieve everything that had been hoped. The person who worked intelligently for truth, justice, beauty, or compassion was aligning themselves with the deepest currents of existence, participating in purposes that gave their individual lives significance within larger patterns of meaning and value. The participation in cosmic purpose that Maimonides advocated wasn't mystical or otherworldly, but was grounded in careful attention to the actual structure of reality, as revealed through reason, experience, and the accumulated wisdom of thoughtful predecessors. It required no special revelations or extraordinary experiences, though it was compatible with and could be enhanced by such experiences when they occurred. What it did require was the kind of patient, comprehensive education that could develop human capacities for understanding and virtue to whatever degree they were capable of development. This education needed to be both theoretical and practical, both individual and communal, both rooted in established tradition and open to genuine innovation when circumstances required it. Maimonides understood himself to be contributing to this ongoing educational project through his various writings and activities, by demonstrating how apparently competing sources of wisdom could be integrated, how abstract principles could guide concrete decisions, and how individual excellence could serve communal welfare. He hoped to provide resources that others could use in their own development and in their efforts to improve the communities of which they were part. The educational vision that guided all of Maimonides' work was fundamentally optimistic about human possibilities while remaining realistic about human limitations. He believed that every person possessed some capacity for growth in understanding and character, though such capacity might be developed to very different degrees depending on natural endowment, external circumstances, and personal effort. This meant that educational efforts should be designed to meet people where they actually were, rather than where ideally they might be, while also providing pathways for whatever growth they proved capable of achieving. The effective teacher or leader would have multiple approaches available, and would choose among them based on careful assessment of what each individual or community actually needed. The same principle applied to how educational content should be structured and presented. Complex truths that might overwhelm beginners could be communicated gradually through carefully sequenced experiences that allowed understanding to develop organically rather than being imposed prematurely from outside. Maimonides' own major works exemplify this pedagogical sensitivity. They begin with concepts and problems that would be familiar to readers from their existing experience and education, then gradually introduce more sophisticated ideas and methods, as the reader's capacity to handle them has been prepared through earlier sections of the work. This developmental approach to communication reflected Maimonides' deeper understanding of how genuine learning actually occurred. It wasn't simply a matter of transferring information from one mind to another, like pouring water from one container into another. It required creating conditions in which students could discover truth for themselves through their own thinking and experience, guided by appropriate instruction but not overwhelmed by it. The discovery that emerged from this kind of learning would be both more lasting and more personally meaningful than conclusions that were simply accepted on external authority. The person who had worked through important questions for themselves would understand not only what was true but why it was true, not only what should be done but why it should be done. This personal appropriation of inherited wisdom was essential for the kind of intellectual and moral maturity that could sustain itself under pressure and continue developing throughout an entire lifetime. The individual who truly understood the foundations of their convictions would be able to adapt those convictions creatively to new circumstances without abandoning their essential content. As these quiet streams of Maimonides' wisdom continue to flow through the peaceful spaces of approaching rest, we can feel how his understanding of education and development offers something particularly valuable to minds seeking both growth and stability. Rather than presenting learning as a competitive struggle or character development as a grim duty, he showed how both could become natural expressions of human nature, operating according to its proper principles. His example suggests that the desire to understand and to become better is itself evidence of our participation in purposes that transcend our individual limitations. The very longing for wisdom and virtue points toward realities that make such longing meaningful and that provide the resources needed for its gradual fulfillment. The person who approaches learning and development with this kind of trust in the ultimate compatibility between human nature and human possibilities will find themselves able to sustain effort over long periods without becoming discouraged by slow progress or temporary setbacks. They will understand that the process itself is valuable, that each genuine step forward contributes to something larger than the individual achievement, and that patient persistence guided by clear understanding will naturally lead toward whatever growth is possible within their particular circumstances and capacities. The gentle confidence that animated all of Maimonides' educational work continues to whisper across the centuries, suggesting that the human mind and heart, when properly cultivated and patiently guided, can find in existence itself the resources needed for both understanding and peace, for both individual fulfillment and service to the common good, for both temporal engagement and participation in purposes that extend far beyond any individual lifetime, yet remain intimately connected to the choices and commitments that shape each passing moment of conscious, caring, thoughtful life. In these final gentle moments of our journey through Maimonides' luminous world of thought, we find ourselves returning to where we began, yet transformed by the passage through his mind's careful architecture. Like travellers who have walked through a vast and beautiful garden, we carry with us not just memories of individual flowers or pathways, but something deeper, a sense of the underlying design that made the whole garden possible, the patient hand that planted and tended it across seasons of growth. What emerges most clearly from our quiet wandering through Maimonides' philosophy is perhaps something unexpected. Not the complexity one might fear from such a systematic thinker, but a profound simplicity that underlies all genuine wisdom. His great insight was that reality itself is fundamentally coherent, that the same principles which govern the movement of stars also guide the development of human character, that the same wisdom which structures the physical universe also provides the foundation for ethics, politics, and the spiritual life. This vision of underlying unity transforms how we might understand our own small place in the vast scheme of things. Rather than feeling lost in an indifferent cosmos or overwhelmed by the apparent chaos of daily existence, we can sense ourselves as participants in a conversation that has been going on since the beginning of time, contributors to a story whose ending we cannot see, but whose basic plot we can begin to understand. The conversation is between mind and reality, between human longing for meaning and the world's patient willingness to reveal its secrets to those who approach it with appropriate reverence and careful attention. Each generation adds its own voice to this dialogue, asking questions shaped by its particular circumstances, while drawing on insights that have been tested and refined by countless previous seekers. Maimonides' contribution to this conversation was to show that the apparent tensions which trouble thoughtful people in every age, the seeming conflicts between reason and faith, individual fulfillment and social responsibility, temporal engagement and eternal perspective, can be resolved not by choosing sides but by understanding how apparent opposites can become partners in a more comprehensive vision of human possibility. The key to this resolution lay in what we might call his principle of hierarchical harmony. Different aspects of human existence operate at different levels and serve different purposes, but when properly understood and appropriately ordered, they can reinforce rather than conflict with each other. Physical health supports mental clarity, which enables moral insight, which guides practical action, which creates conditions for further understanding in an ascending spiral of development that can continue throughout an entire lifetime. This hierarchical understanding allowed Maimonides to embrace the full range of human experience without being torn apart by competing demands. He could value the pleasures of the body while recognizing their proper place within larger patterns of meaning. He could appreciate the importance of social relationships while understanding how they connected to more fundamental questions about the nature of justice and community. He could engage wholeheartedly with the practical problems of his time, while maintaining perspective about their significance within the longer story of human development. The same integrative wisdom shaped his approach to the great questions that have always puzzled human beings. What is the meaning of existence? How should we live? What can we know? What should we hope? Rather than treating these as separate problems requiring different kinds of solutions, Maimonides showed how they were different aspects of a single question. How can finite beings participate meaningfully in infinite reality? His answer was both simple and inexhaustible, through the patient cultivation of our distinctive human capacities for understanding, virtue, and appreciation. The mind that seeks truth with appropriate humility and persistence will find not only knowledge but peace. The heart that opens itself to genuine goodness will discover not only right action but joy. The soul that learns to recognize and appreciate the extraordinary gift of existence itself will find not only meaning, but a kind of participation in the eternal perspective that sees all temporal events within their proper context. This participation in eternal perspective didn't require withdrawal from temporal concerns, but rather provided the foundation for more effective engagement with them. The person who understood their place within larger patterns of meaning could work more wholeheartedly for improvement in immediate circumstances because they were not paralyzed by anxiety about outcomes beyond their control or crushed by the weight of problems too large for any individual to solve completely. The serenity that emerged from this understanding was not the serenity of indifference, but the serenity of trust. Trust in the ultimate intelligibility and goodness of a reality that had given rise to minds capable of recognizing its intelligibility and hearts capable of appreciating its goodness. This trust didn't eliminate difficulty or guarantee success in particular endeavors, but it provided a foundation for hope that could sustain effort even in the most challenging circumstances. As we allow these final reflections to settle into the deeper rhythms of approaching rest, we can sense how Maimonides' example continues to offer something particularly valuable to contemporary seekers. In an age often characterized by fragmentation, skepticism, and anxiety about meaning, his vision of integrated wisdom provides a model for how human beings can find both understanding and peace without abandoning intellectual honesty or ethical commitment. His life and work stand as testimony to the possibility of human flourishing even in the midst of uncertainty and change, of intellectual clarity even when surrounded by confusion and conflict, of spiritual peace even while fully engaged with the urgent questions and practical needs of one's own historical moment. The synthesis he achieved between contemplation and action, individual development and communal service, temporal engagement and eternal perspective, points toward possibilities for human existence that transcend the false choices that often seem to constrain our options. In the quiet spaces where philosophy meets life, where ancient wisdom encounters contemporary questions, where the human mind recognizes itself as both questioner and participant in the great mystery that encompasses all existence, we find the gentle confidence that animated all of Maimonides' work, that reality is ultimately trustworthy, that human beings are equipped to understand their situation and respond appropriately, and that the careful, patient pursuit of truth and goodness will lead naturally toward the kinds of understanding and peace that make existence not just bearable, but deeply fulfilling. The same mind that can recognize problems can also discover solutions. The same heart that can feel confusion can also find clarity. The same soul that seeks meaning can also find it, written into the very structure of a universe that welcomes rather than resists our deepest aspirations for knowledge, virtue, and joy. In this recognition lies both the beginning and the end of philosophy, both the question that sets us searching and the answer that allows us finally to rest, not in ignorance but in wonder, not in certainty but in trust, not in isolation but in communion with the inexhaustible mystery that holds us all. And so, As the gentle currents of sleep begin to claim this quiet hour, we can carry with us Maimonides' most precious gift, the understanding that to be human is to participate in something infinitely larger than ourselves, that our questions and longings connect us to purposes that extend far beyond our individual lives, and that the very capacity to seek wisdom and meaning is itself evidence of our participation in the divine wisdom that governs all things with patient love, calling each of us home to the peace that passes understanding, the rest that comes not from the absence of questions, but from trust in the one who holds all answers in the eternal silence that embraces every word we speak and every dream we dream in the vast, patient, luminous mystery of existence itself. And so we reach the end of our gentle journey through the luminous world of Moses' Maimonides, though perhaps end is not quite the right word, for the insights we've encountered tonight don't conclude but continue, flowing like quiet streams into the deeper currents of your own reflection and rest. We've walked with the great eagle through his exile and his searching, through his integration of reason and faith, through his patient weaving together of threads that others thought could never touch. We've seen how one mind, properly cultivated and oriented toward truth, could become a bridge between worlds, a source of harmony where others found only conflict. His legacy whispers to us still across the centuries, suggesting that the apparent complexity and confusion of existence need not overwhelm us, that the same capacity for wonder that allows a child to be fascinated by ordinary things, when refined and deepened through patient inquiry, can transform our relationship to reality itself. That wisdom is not something we grasp, but something that grasps us when we approach it with appropriate humility and genuine care. Tonight, as these reflections settle into the quieter rhythms of sleep, you carry with you Maimonides' most peaceful insight, that to be human is to participate in something infinitely larger and more beautiful than ourselves, that our questions connect us to purposes that extend far beyond our individual lives, and that the very longing for understanding and meaning is itself evidence of our place in the vast, patient, luminous order that holds us all. Sleep well, gentle seekers. The same wisdom that guided Maimonides through his restless world continues to move through ours, calling each of us home to the peace that comes not from having all the answers, but from trusting in the ultimate harmony that embraces every question we ask and every dream we dream, in the quiet spaces where philosophy meets rest, where ancient wisdom touches contemporary hearts, where the human soul finds itself welcomed into the eternal conversation between mind and mystery. Thank you for joining me tonight in this corner of sleepy philosophy. Until we meet again in another gentle exploration of the great ideas that have shaped human understanding, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be filled with wonder.